Hello, I'm Jonasz Lewiński and you're watching TVP World Talks, where every word matters. The Trump team's unconventional approach to diplomacy has triggered a state akin to mild panic among some European leaders, with reports surfacing in the media that Washington could be ready for far-reaching concessions to appease Moscow. Poland, the linchpin of NATO's eastern flank, was therefore somewhat relieved when US Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, General Kellogg, assured Poland's president that the US presence in the region would not experience any major shift. Meanwhile, heated discussions continue among European countries as to possible involvement in the future peace plan, with Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk brushing aside the idea of sending Polish troops as peacekeepers. Joining us now is Marcin Terlikowski, Head of Research at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning.
So first and foremost, should we feel reassured by the statement of General Kellogg that the United States is not planning to withdraw any troops, at least not from the eastern flank?
Well, certainly. We have seen a number of speculations about what will Trump administration do as regards American military posture in Europe. And we have seen some dramatic suggestions, some dramatic scenarios being discussed in media with the US leaving Europe fully, withdrawing from NATO. And we are now getting a strong signal that these were just speculations, that the US, and we've heard that from both from Kellogg and Secretary Hexet in Ramstein a few days ago, that the US considers itself to be bounded by Article 5 and considered itself to be fully engaged in European security on the condition that Europe steps up, as J.D. Vance said, in a big way with regards to its defense spending and defense capacity, so to say.
Do you think that there might be a shift in the way this presence is distributed across Europe? For example, moving troops away from countries further in the west and into eastern flank countries as a kind of reward for their involvement in NATO, perhaps also a rebuke for countries like Germany, which have not reached the necessary spending thresholds? There have been suggestions like that.
It is possible for two reasons. First is the political reason. We have seen that during the first Trump presidency, there was an attempt to move some troops out of Germany, but what then happened was a decision of Pentagon, of the US Department of State, to move only a tiny fraction of the forces, simply because the logistics is there and simply because a major overhaul of how American military presence looks like in Europe would require new investments, basically. So there is a limit to that. But in the context of what's happening and what will be happening in Ukraine, with a likely ceasefire or a halt of hostilities, whatever you will call the political vehicle which will be used to stop the fighting, there will be a need for some more robust rear area, so to say, presence of American and other European forces. And Poland is logically and geographically the most suitable place for that presence. So yes, we may see some as we've seen today in the media, some beef up of American forces and also other European forces in the eastern flank because of what next for Ukraine.
What kind of reinforcement could we be talking about? Poland's president has mentioned the idea of Fort Trump, and of course many of us would probably like to see this sort of installation being placed squarely in the Suwałki Gap, just to dispel any ideas that Putin might have about invading that particular region.
Well, Fort Trump is a very nice, let's say, political concept, but of course we're not talking about a huge fortress, a huge military base. We are talking about a much more diversified and much more, let's say, tailored American presence, which would be required to both deter Russia from a potential escalation against NATO and to reinforce Ukraine's security. And this is
a small facility would actually serve as a tripwire, as a warning that, if you're thinking about invading, perhaps you should reconsider.
Yes, and we do have this kind of presence in Poland, in the Baltic states. We have seen it since 2017 in the form of so-called enhanced forward presence, then beefed up to the level of brigade, which is still in the process. But the most important thing for me now is the leak which was presented in Washington Post very recently, saying that the potential international contingent this peacekeeping force for Ukraine would not necessarily be deployed to Ukraine, but as I said, in the rear area. So we may actually see these American enablers particularly, so like air assets or ISR, so the surveillance, reconnaissance assets deployed to Poland to serve as this guarantee, which is broadly discussed in the media as a guarantee for Ukraine, as one of the elements of the international security guarantees for Ukraine. These are now purely speculations. But for me now, it is clear that the appetite of Western leaders to actually deploy troops to Ukraine is very low, and no one is considering deploying, as Macron said it, I'm quoting, belligerent forces to Ukraine. Rather, to build a force, again I will use this word, in rear area, which could serve as a credible reinforcement of Ukraine if Russia decides to escalate again. If this scenario happens, and for me it's now just a speculation, I'm speculating now, then Poland will be the biggest beneficiary, so to say, of this reinforcement of Allied and American presence in Europe and in the eastern flank.
From the Ukrainian side, though, would that actually work if you had no troops present on the line of contact, wherever that line of contact may be? This could invite some sort of violations almost immediately. Do you think that other countries perhaps could be persuaded to fill the void, such as India, for instance?
Well, there has been talk about a multinational peacekeeping force with non-NATO countries, which are traditionally big providers of troops for UN peacekeeping operations, like India, like Pakistan, like African nations as well.
China. Lavrov said he doesn't want any NATO countries there because he considers them to be co-belligerents or something like that.
Yes, but I feel that for securing the line of contact, the military presence of Ukrainian troops, well trained and backed up, so to say, by a credible Western reinforcements would be enough. Or perhaps, again, I'm speculating, we may see a deployment of some kind of, white helmets kind of force with no real mandate to engage actively, but to serve as monitors. We have this kind of mission. This is the European Union monitoring mission in Georgia, which is monitoring the line of contact following the 2008 Russian attack on Georgia. Mostly in South Ossetia. These forces are there. These are not a proper, let's say, military force, but an observer force.
Do you think that European countries on the eastern flank should engage in talks about nuclear sharing?
Oh yes, definitely. The nuclear sharing is let's say, one element of a broader problem, broader question, what to do with NATO nuclear posture, with NATO nuclear policy, in the situation in which Russia is developing its, let's say, means of delivery, so new ways of deploying nuclear devices, nuclear warheads. We have seen Russia investing into new capabilities. We need to find an answer. One of the answers, again, in my opinion, the lowest hanging fruit is to broaden the number of countries which are engaged in nuclear sharing, not necessarily meaning redeployment of American nuclear assets in Europe to new countries.
I'm asking also because there are forecasts that Russia is going to retain its massive manufacturing capability, and some say Europe simply is not going to have enough troops or tanks to stop it at some point perhaps. But this is just like during the Cold War. During the Cold War, Russia had a massive advantage, but NATO had tactical nukes positioned right where they needed them to, so essentially deterring Russia from conducting this sort of massive land invasion. Do you think that we're simply looking at the Cold War 2.0 scenario here, potentially?
Well, precisely because you use the word Cold War 2.0, this is I would say even unacceptable for many allies to even think about this kind of scenario. But this is the direction in which we have to look to find the answer to this let's say changed Russian threat to NATO, because we may quite surely assume that Russia will rely much more on the nuclear blackmail, on the nuclear scenario, nuclear saber rattling in a potential escalation with NATO than it did in case of its invasion of Ukraine, because Putin, of course, made quite explicit nuclear threats But one of the lessons learned, back in 2022, but one of the lessons learned he might have taken from Ukraine is that he should be much more explicit, and in case of escalating conflict with NATO, actually cross the nuclear threshold. And we have to be ready to talk about what we will do as NATO, as allies in such a scenario, without, let's say, any taboos. We need to start the discussion now. This is, of course, the job for the military leaders, for the political leaders, and for the experts.
Marcin Terlikowski was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm Jan Czerwiński. You're watching TVP World. Please stay with us here for more latest news and features.